In the last session, we looked at semi-variable costs, and we saw that semi-variable costs are costs which contain both a fixed and a variable element. And we said that total cost for a company is a semi-variable cost. Now, if we have a semi-variable cost, like total cost, what we want to do is establish what part of that cost is the fixed element and what part of it is the variable element. The first method we have to calculate the fixed and variable elements of a semi-variable cost is the high-low method. So this is used to separate the fixed and variable elements of a semi-variable cost. So, how does the high-low method work? Well, once again, if we think about this on a graph, we're looking at the total costs for a company and the level of activity. In the high-low method, what we start with is two sets of data. So we will already have calculated, or we will be given in the question, what total costs for the company are at some low level of activity. And we will also know what total costs would be at some high level of activity. When we are using the high-low method, we assume a linear relationship between total cost and level of activity. Which means if we have these two data points, then we can use them to calculate the line between the two. So we assume that this linear relationship exists between our high level of activity and our low level of activity. And if we draw the line between these 2 points, then we can use that line to estimate what total costs would be at any other level of activity. To illustrate how the high-low method can be used, we're going to look at an exercise. So, we're given the following cost information. We have 2 different levels of activity, and we are told what total cost would be at each of those 2 levels of activity. So we've got our low level of activity, 65,000 units, and we've got our high level of activity, 105,000 units. We've been asked, using the above data, calculate the fixed and variable costs for the business and the total cost for 165,000 units. When we're using the high-low method, the first step we do is to calculate the variable cost per unit, which will be equal to the total costs at the high level minus the total costs at the low level divided by our level of activity at the high level minus our level of activity at the low level. Remember, we are assuming that there is a linear relationship between our low-level data and our high-level data. And we assume that that line represents the relationship between total cost and level of activity. If that is the case, it means that all of the change in our total costs at each level of activity is due to the change in the number of units we're producing. So we can calculate the variable cost per unit by looking at the change in the total costs divided by the change in the number of units we've produced. So once we know how to calculate the variable cost per unit, we just need to put in the figures. So our total costs at the high level of activity were 210,000. Minus our total costs at the low level of activity, 133,000. And we divide by our units at the high level minus our units at the low level. If you work that through on your calculators then, you should come up with a variable cost per unit of £1.925. And that's our first step done. So we've calculated the variable element of total cost. Step 2 then is to calculate the fixed costs. And how do we do this? Well, we know that total cost is equal to fixed cost plus variable cost. If we just move this equation around a little bit, we see that fixed costs then is equal to total cost minus our variable cost. And just expanding that out a little further so we all know what we're doing, fixed costs will be equal to total cost minus our variable costs at that level of activity. And just remember, our total variable cost at any level of activity will be the variable cost per unit multiplied by our level of activity, or the number of units we've produced. So if we know this equation, then again, we just need to put in the numbers. Looking back at the information we were given in the question, when we're calculating our fixed costs, we can use either one of our levels of activity. Regardless of whether we look at the low level of activity or the high level of activity to do this calculation, we will get the same answer. So it doesn't matter which one we choose. I'm going to go with the low level of activity, but you can try it yourself with the high level of activity and you'll get the very same result. So, putting that information in then, we can calculate that fixed costs will be equal to total costs, which are 133,000 at the low level of activity, minus our variable cost per unit, which we now know is 1.925, multiplied by our level of activity, 65,000 at the low level. Put that into your calculators then, and you should work out that the fixed costs are equal to 7,875. So we're nearly there. We were asked to work out one last piece of information. We were asked to calculate what total costs will be if we produce 165,000 units. Now, if we know the variable cost per unit and we know what the fixed costs are for the company, we can use this information to forecast or estimate what total costs will be at any other level of activity. So let's do that now. So our third step is to calculate total cost for 665,000 units. Just remember that total cost will be equal to our fixed cost plus our total variable cost, which will be the variable cost per unit multiplied by our level of activity. So our total cost then is equal to our fixed cost of 7,875 plus our variable cost per unit 1.925 multiplied by the number of units we're producing. So our total cost, if you work that through, will be 325,500. And that's our 3 steps complete. Now, before we finish up this section, we just do need to look at a complication which may arise in these high-low method questions. So we're going to look at another exercise. So in this exercise, we're given, again, 2 different activity levels. A low level of activity, 17,000 units, and our high level of activity, 22,000 units. And we're told what total cost will be at each 2 levels of activity. Then we're told variable cost per unit is constant in this range of activity, which is what we would expect. Remember, we said we expect variable cost per unit to be constant. However, there is a step up of £5,000 in total fixed costs when activity exceeds 18,000 units. And our question is, what is the total cost at an activity level of 20,000 units? So again, we would need to apply our 3 steps to work through this. Calculate the variable cost per unit, calculate the fixed costs, and use that to work out total cost for 20,000 units. However, before we can apply our 3 steps in the high-low method, first we need to deal with any complications that have been given to us in the question. Namely, we have to deal with this change in the fixed costs. When we apply the high-low method, we are making a number of assumptions. So remember, we said we are assuming a linear relationship between our total costs and our level of activity. So we're assuming that all of the change in total cost is because of the change in the activity level. In this question, we've been told that not all of the change in cost is because of the change in activity level. Part of the change is because of this step up in our fixed costs. Before we can apply our high-low method, the following 2 things must be true. Fixed costs must be constant across the 2 activity levels. Meaning the fixed costs need to be the same at the high level of activity as they are at the low level of activity. In addition to that, the variable cost per unit must be constant. If you are told in a question that either of these things are not the case, so if there is a change in our fixed costs or if there is a change in the variable cost per unit, then the first thing you must do is adjust your data to remove that change in the fixed costs. So let's look at our data again. We have our activity levels and our total costs. Our low level of activity is 17,000 units, when our total costs are 140,000. And our high level of activity is 22,000 units, when our total costs are 170,000. Now, we've been specifically told in the question that the variable cost per unit is constant, so we don't need to worry about that. But we've been told that the fixed costs increase by £5,000 when our activity level goes above 18,000 units. Which means when we produce 22,000 units, our fixed costs are £5,000 higher than they were when we produced 17,000 units. So now our fixed costs are not constant across these two levels of activity. So what do we need to do? Well, all we need to do is adjust our data to remove the change in the fixed costs. So we need to look at these total costs at the high level of activity and make an adjustment. So this £170,000 total cost includes the additional £5,000 fixed costs. So, if our fixed costs never changed, if we didn't incur this additional £5,000, then what would our total costs at the high level of activity be? Well, they'd be 170,000 minus the additional 5,000, so 165,000. So this 165,000 represents our adjusted total costs at the high level of activity. This is what our total costs would be at that level if the fixed costs remain constant. Now, if we use this adjusted total cost figure with our low level of activity information, then our fixed costs are constant across the two levels of activity. So we can move into our steps then. Step 1, we calculate the variable cost per unit. So our total costs at the high level of activity, and you must remember to use the adjusted total costs, minus our total costs at the low level, 140,000, divided by our activity at the high level minus our activity at the low level. So our variable cost per unit then is £5. Moving on to step 2 to calculate the fixed costs. Remember, our fixed costs will be total cost minus variable cost per unit, multiplied by the number of units we've produced. So if we look at our low level of activity to calculate our fixed costs, there'll be 140,000 minus our variable cost per unit, multiplied by 17,000 units. So our fixed costs are £55,000. Our final step then is, once we've calculated the variable cost per unit and the fixed costs, we can use this to estimate what total costs will be when we produce 20,000 units. Remember, our total cost will be our fixed costs plus our variable cost. So, first question, what will our fixed costs be when we produce 20,000 units? Well, we've just worked out in step 2 that our fixed costs are £55,000. But we need to be very careful. We used our low level of activity to calculate the fixed costs. Remember, in the question we were told that fixed costs increase when our level of activity goes above 18,000 units. Above that level, our fixed costs increase by £5,000. So when we produce 20,000 units, what are our fixed costs going to be? Well, we will have the original 55,000, but we need to add on the additional 5,000 because we've gone above the threshold. And then finally, our variable costs will be £5 multiplied by 20,000 units. So the total cost, when you work that through, for 20,000 units is £160,000. If we look back at our question, hopefully that's part of the multiple choice answers we were given. There it is, answer C, 160,000.